Welcome, everyone. Today, New York State Council of Churches is pleased to begin a series of monthly conversations about the practice of anti-racism. My name is Peter Cook, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches, and I'll be serving as your moderator today for a conversation that will last until 5:30. We'll be recording the session today, and it will be available for viewing on our website, along with a growing list of materials and trainings offered by denominations and many others. And we're also grateful to the Social Holiness team of the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church and the Synod of the Northeast of the Presbyterian Church for their support of this initiative. And we will welcome more sponsors as we go along. The goal of our initiative is to not duplicate the fine work already being done. Instead, our goal is to create a space where secular and religious people can critically discuss the work of anti-racism through a historical, theological, policy, personal, and practical lens. We enter into these conversations with much humility, knowing that there are generations of people who have been working at this conversation for a very long time, maybe over 400 years, in fact. Every denomination struggles with its racist underpinnings, and in recent decades have created their own programs to examine their history and to make amends. Secular and religious groups have set up extensive anti-racism education and training programs to help the public sharpen their awareness and act on being anti-racist. There are copious publications, books, videos, and periodicals which have been produced, and all of us in our public discourse struggle with politicians and our neighbors who use dog whistles to eliminate the discussion of things like critical race theory, while routinely reinforcing racist public policies which perpetuate the grossest forms of inequality. I think many of us, based on life experience, can be lulled into thinking subconsciously that we are experts on the topic of racism, either through personal experience, study, or both. It's possible, given our orientation, that we might think we are just a little more anti-racist than someone else. There is, I have discovered, a lot of ego among practitioners in denominational and secular circles who are pretty certain their program is just a little better or more enlightened than those of other folks. The truth is, of course, that we need to be open to looking at the limitations of our own systems. And if we can't explain the limits of what we do, then it's possible we don't understand what we are doing very well. While former President Trump propagated some of the most racist public policies imaginable, he gave himself cover by saying that he was the least racist person you would ever meet. Now, we might all laugh or cry at the president's hypocrisy, but we must be also aware of our own pretense. To be sure, we are required to do good personal introspection, but our programs must not be laced with an unspoken assumption that they are the least racist programs you will ever encounter. And we must also be aware of our own denominational silos, which can prevent us from learning from other denominations' approaches, which might challenge our most cherished assumptions. To be honest, as I begin this project with all of you, I feel much less confident in my knowledge about anti-racism than when I first started. I come to this inquiry with far more questions than answers. Perhaps one limitation we have in common is a tendency to detach anti-racist reflection from concrete advocacy to change racist policies which perpetuate inequality. How tempting it is to be a well-trained anti-racist who has done copious amounts of study and participated in many trainings on how to be an anti-racist and then turn around and oppose the development of affordable housing in our own backyards. We have the courage to reverse a history of redlining and predatory lending, which have prevented people of color who live right down the street from us from accumulating wealth or owning a home. This discrimination is particularly pernicious in New York, which is why we focus so heavily on countering not in my backyard sentiment that enables racist zoning policies while advocating for more public dollars for affordable housing. Or when it comes to mass incarceration, we are too inclined sometimes to let politicians get away with telling us that they support the intent of bail reform, discovery reform, and raise the age laws, but then we let them turn around and play on our fears as they press for changes, which will only incarcerate more Black and brown people while doing nothing to address the real causes of crime. Will the pressure we feel not to oppose a popular governor get the best of us and cause us to abandon our anti-racist principles? All along the way in our work, we must not become detached observers, but take the risk to build community with one another. And that will mean venturing outside the walls of our congregations to listen really well to our neighbors, show up in public meetings, and build relationships with congregations which may have racial makeups and theologies which might be very different than our own. We must always be asking, is my framework getting in the way of building authentic relationships or listening to nuance? This is just a small sampling of some of the tensions and topics we will explore together on a monthly basis for the foreseeable future. We invite you to this series to learn and grow with us, knowing that all of us have far more questions than answers. Be prepared to be challenged and even annoyed by what you hear. It's all part of the learning process. So, to get us started, we wish to hear from some people who lead anti-racism trainings for the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, and the United Church of Christ. We are curious to learn from them about their approaches, what they have learned doing this work, and what they see as challenges ahead in doing anti-racism work with congregations and the communities they serve. And so our first speaker today will be Charles Sims, who is with the Imagine No Racism initiative for the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church. And then he will be followed by Glenda Smith, who's with the same initiative, and the Reverend Marty Swartz-Harrell, who's the senior pastor at the First United Methodist Church of Oneonta. And so, Charles, would you like to begin?
Well, I think, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. I think we'll begin with Belinda. We kind of worked out with ourselves how we would proceed, and she's going to start, so I'll turn it over.
Okay, very good.
Excellent.
We're flexible. Yeah, Charles and I talked yesterday, and I'm going to give you a 2-minute quick overview of how the no racism came to be. And then we have 6 sessions, so I'm going to do 3 sessions in a minute each, and then Charles is going to do 3 more, just to get us started. So imagine no racism in Upper New York is I don't want to say program, but I don't have a better word. It has 6 sessions, about an hour and a half each, over 6 weeks. And people can flex that, whatever schedule works for people. But basically, the history is that the United Methodist Church, first of all, is around the world. But in the United States, we break up into geographic areas. And we are the Northeast jurisdiction, which goes from Maine down to West Virginia. I was at a meeting in 2016 with this Northeast group. And at that time, there was so much overt racism in our country that our bishops created what they called a call to action. And that call to action said that every one of the sub areas from Maine down to West Virginia, they're called conferences, would come up with their own plan to fight racism. And for Upper New York, which essentially is all of New York State, except for New York City and a little bit north. And we had at that time about 800 local churches, maybe about 600 clergy. And the plan was the bishop created a task force, and we worked for about 1.5 years, researching, planning, praying, discerning how to do this. So in 2018, we were ready, and we had what we call a launch date. The bishop required every clergy person to be at this launch day, and it was scattered all over the state. The plan was that every pastor would learn about this experience it, and then take it home to their local church. So everybody would hear about imagining no racism. Well, it didn't quite work that easily. There were clergy who resisted, and we're still working on that. Okay. Charles and I have done several of these sessions together. And the first thing I want to say is we don't teach, we facilitate. This is not the gurus of knowledge telling people what they need to know. This is facilitating conversation so people can grapple with each of the topics and discern and question and have dialogue. And the other thing about every single of the 6 sessions starts with prayer, with a very carefully chosen scripture and devotion that addresses whatever that topic is going to be. Okay, so that's the overview. The sessions, I'll do the first 3 and then Charles will take over. The first one, the bishop did a video, very powerful video, used the Good Samaritan as the model to say that if you don't love your neighbor, that is sin, and worked into racism is sin. We did basic definitions in that first session. The simplest prejudice is prejudging, and down to racism, which we grappled with so people would get the notion that racism is racial prejudice plus the power to enforce the institutions and systems in an area. Then the last thing we did in session 1 was look at John Wesley's 3 simple rules. Of course, he's the founder of Methodism. And we related each of those 3 rules to racism. And those rules are do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God. Okay. Session 2, we addressed our baptism vows. We took very seriously words like this: reject the spiritual forces of wickedness and accept the freedom and power that God gives you to resist evil and injustice in whatever forms they take. Surprisingly, a lot of people never took their baptism vows in or looked at them in terms of racism. But clearly what you heard there, we have the freedom and the power to resist evil and injustice. And we operationalize that by looking at white privilege, the very basic Peggy McIntosh white privileges. As an example, how white people, absolutely, it's an injustice what we can do and what other people of color can't. And then the third one is implicit bias. We found a great YouTube that really clarified what that is for people. And typically we find white people are astonished that they had such unconscious biases they didn't know about. So that's been very helpful. We also operationalize that by looking at microaggressions and the fact that even well-meaning white people do things and say things that they don't realize cause harm. And that's a big focus for that. So Charles, I'll turn it over to you for the last three.
Yeah, so as a group, we work hard to stay away from using the, and to kind of follow up what Glenda said a few minutes ago, we work hard staying away from the word training, which a lot of people really look at, want to keep calling this as training. And we really look at it as an experience. For me, training is, you go learn something and maybe you use it or maybe you don't. And we recognize that Imagine No Racism really is the beginning of the conversation for a lot of people. They really don't have a lot of experience. They really haven't thought about this. So session 4, the other thing, in all the sessions, there are questions that we pose to participants. So we really, as Glenda really pointed out, we really see the members of the people who are leading as facilitators. And when we're training them to become facilitators, we constantly reinforce that so that they remember that they're facilitating the conversation, they're not leading the group. It's a more interactive, didactic kind of process than us giving information to. So session 4 is really about the important issue in session 4 that we try to get across, we try to work with is, we try to help people understand that there are different kinds of racism, and individual, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic. So we spend some time, session 4 is spent around that and around exercises to help people understand those differences. And we do have a video that we use as the backdrop or to help, or the platform to help us talk about that particular issue. Session 5, we really are, and on session 4, we call that deepening the conversation. Session 5 is really about deconstructing white privilege. And what we want to have happen there is we can't move forward until we have that discussion. And people can't move towards being anti-racist until they have an understanding of what white privilege is. And we work with deconstructing what that means. It's not about somebody being superior. It's really about a place in society. And we want people to have that information frequently, because there's so much misinformation in the society at large about what we mean by white privilege. And we have an excellent video on that. I think it works really well. Robin DiAngelo has done a lot of work with in the area of white privilege. She's a white sociologist, and she's committed her life to doing this work. Not everybody agrees with what she has to say, but I think in this particular case, she makes some very good points, and she provides some very solid examples of what that looks like and how those reinforce one another, and how those reinforce white white privilege. So a lot of people walk away saying, I never thought of it like that. The final session is we ask people to bring it all together and to create a plan. If we're working with a church, what will that plan be for that church? How do they take what they've learned and move that forward into a concrete plan that they're going to optimize? And we provide, we provide frameworks in the material to do that. Everyone who comes into the Imagine No Racism experience gets a workbook, and in that workbook is the outline for that particular plan. So there's a workbook for the participants. There's a workbook for the facilitators, and we have resources for both parties in that particular workbook that they can have.
Can I add one thing, please? To our surprise, well, maybe I shouldn't say to my surprise, there's a lot of people who are at such a ground level with this work. This may seem simplistic to you, but this is revolutionary to a lot of people in upstate New York, especially rural New York. So it's not simplistic at all. When they come up with a plan, it's likely to be not more than how do they work within their local church? Can they watch a movie and talk and have questions about it? Can they read a book or do a Bible study? Pretty fundamental, but that's where a lot of people are.
All right, is it my turn now?
Go
I'm
ahead,
Marty Swords Harrell, and thank you, Charles, and thank you, Blenda, two of our train the trainer people. Even though we're not training, we're facilitating. I was trained to be a facilitator. We had some training in the fall of 2019, and we offered our class here in the middle of rural New York. Very few people signed up, and then came the horrific and tragic murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And suddenly everybody wanted to take this class. And it didn't matter that the bishop had already told us, 9 months earlier that everybody had to take it. Everybody was very much ignoring him until that very tragic day, May 25th of 2020. So anyway, so since then I have taught or co-facilitated this class, Imagine No Racism, 7 times. Many rural clergy here, I have taught many, most of it was by Zoom because we were in the middle of the pandemic. So that has its limitations, as you know, but I think it also made it possible for many more people to at least put their toe in, which they may or may not have if we hadn't offered it that way. So we had to adapt it somewhat, of course. But I want to say amen to everything that Belinda and Charles just shared. I think for me, one of the big challenges, seeing as I grew up in New York City and served in Chicago for 10 years before I came to Central New York, there were a lot of people among the clergy who were in my classes who would say, well, we just don't need to talk about this because we don't have any people of color in our area, and certainly not in our church, which is not true. But they had to open their eyes to some possibilities. I mean, even here in our little town of Oneonta, which is of course a college town, one of our authors that we read, Dr. Ibram Kendi, used to teach here early in his career. And he was profiled. We heard the story of when he came for his interview. I believe he was a postdoc at that time. The people who were supposed to be interviewing him for a position at SUNY Oneonta saw him coming down the sidewalk. They were sitting in one of the local restaurants. And as he was coming down the sidewalk, coming to his interview to eat with them, he got nabbed by the police because somebody said, probably said, what's this guy doing here? He doesn't belong here. So on his way to his interview to teach at SUNY Oneonta, and there was also a terrible incident back in the 90s called the Blacklist. If you Google it, you'll find there's a documentary about it. A terrible, terrible incident. But, you know, after people, which had to do with a lot of the African-American students at SUNY Oneonta being accused of something they did not do and terribly wrongly treated. So after we got to talking about some of these very important issues in this class, people began to remember, oh yes, we have had some issues. We have had some things we need to own. So we had to talk a lot about white fragility. Why is it so hard for us white people to admit that we have a problem, that we are racist, that we have blinders on, whatever, that we have economic reasons for not paying any attention to our own racism. So some of these blinders may have come off in this class and others may not have, I'm not sure. I think the biggest challenge for me in teaching the class or co-facilitating, which I did with one of my church members, Margaret Parrish, was the 6th lesson, which has to do with creating a plan. It was very difficult to do that during COVID. So I really probably need to go back to all of my 6 classes and find out, you know, how did that plan go and should we do it over because now we're able to be together more than we were. But it was I can't say it was a pleasure. It was very, very tough. And there were some of my fellow clergy who ended up just kind of ghosting the whole thing. So that was painful, but you know, I think for me, the great hope comes from Ibram Kendi's book, one of his books, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which underlines, because, you know, both parents were AME clergy, or are, I guess, that he just really underlines that humans have a capacity to change and that all life is full of choices. And that, to me, that was great hope. You know, it has to do with confession over and over and over again, and then being willing to start again and knowing you're going to put your foot in it over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
But that you need to just realize that all of us have much, much, much to learn, especially us white people. So I'll leave it there unless there's something else I should say. It was a very good program, but I'm sure it's not the best program. I'm sure we can learn more from our Presbyterian and UCC and many other clergy and lay friends.
I think the point that all of the first 5 sessions lead to some kind of action. This was not a head trip. It's not a, oh, now I know more. It's
Right.
about what are you going to do with it?
Yep.
Whether it's in your local church or in the community just around your church, or maybe you're ready for bigger things like the school to prison pipeline, but some action.
We really try to drive home the point that anti-racism is active. It's an action. It's not a belief system. I mean, that's part of it. But to be an anti-racist, you really there needs to be some kind of action in order to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And we work very hard not to make sure that this is really a conversation. We're not trying to blame anyone. We're not trying to say anyone is bad. What we're trying to do is open individuals' eyes so that they can take that action step.
Mm-hmm.
So we're gonna thank you so much. Before I introduce our next 2 guests, I just want to say that we're going to allow at least half an hour, if not more, for your questions. So you know, feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand or whatever. But we're going to take those questions after our next 2 speakers complete their remarks. So at this time, I'd like to move into the United Church of Christ in Presbyterian worlds and introduce to you the Reverend Dr. William Wilkinson, who is the pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Medina, which for those of you who don't know where that is, that's somewhere about halfway between Buffalo and Rochester. And also the Reverend Alan Daly, who is ordained in the United Church of Christ, but is serving as an interim pastor at John Knox Presbyterian Church in Rochester. And together, Alan and William have been working on anti-racism training and or education or reflection or whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to invite them to share with us their remarks about their work. And I don't know which one of you would like to begin, so
Alan, would you begin?
Alan, there you go.
Okay. We haven't talked about who was going to go first, so, you know, it doesn't matter to me. But since I'm off mute and he's on mute, maybe I'll go first and then I will turn it over to William. We've been doing anti-racism training, or, you know, the educational pieces of the things that need to be done. We've been doing them ecumenically for probably 6 or 7 years off and on. And one of the things that we've found is that it doesn't matter what denomination it's coming out of, because we've just found that there's been a lot of strength in the ecumenical aspect of the work that we've done. The need is there. The biggest thing is that we start to help people understand that this process into this is a journey, because it's just not something that you can do in one session or a couple of sessions. It's an ongoing thing. There's going to be ongoing learning. You're going to move from one stage to another. And so it's really important that it really becomes a commitment to a journey that that you take on and that you keep measuring and you keep growing in it. I mean, one of the things that I share in our in some of the workshops that we've done is that it was a piece that I'd read from an indigenous leader from Western Canada, where he said, where common memory is lacking, where people don't share the same common past, there can be no real community. Where real community is to be formed, common memory must be created. And I think that's really what we're talking about. Certainly it was what I heard Brenda and Charles talking about in the sessions that they do. They cover a lot of the same kinds of issues that we do in the workshops that we've had. And our goal really is to just to help people start to understand, to develop this this common history, because the more common pieces you have in it, the more you can start to understand where somebody else is coming from. And I also have shared with in the beginning of each of our sessions a quote from Franklin. And I found that this has since come from probably Greek mysticism, but it was given to me when I heard it was from Franklin, and that is, justice will never occur until the unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And I think that's true. That's certainly true with myself, is that the more I've gotten involved in this, the more I've gotten to learn about it, the more outraged I become, and the more I'm willing to step out and do things that I might not normally have done 5 years ago. So I usually start out the workshop by saying one of our goals is to start to get you outraged, and you've got a long way to go. And so it's going to be a learning process. It's going to be important. I think in one of the training sessions that I originally had taken, one of the most profound statements that was made is in setting up the process was to expect and accept non-closure, because the process and the journey will take longer than you think. And one of the things that William and I try to work towards is helping people understand, okay, and this goes back to the plan that Belinda was talking about, is you've got to be thinking about how do you want to share this, and how can you share this with your circle, wherever it is. And that's a big piece of where we've got to go, and what we want to do in doing anti-racism work, because it's an educational piece. It certainly is an educational piece for the white community. And it's going to take us a lot longer to start to understand a lot of the bias and a lot of the subtleties of it, along with taking a look at, how do we want to deal with and handle some of the gross pieces. And so it's really critical that we think of it that way. And if if white folks don't think that they can make a difference, there was an article that occurred. It was an op-ed that occurred, and it showed up in the Rochester paper, that was written by Leonard Pitts. And at the end of it, he said, "You'll never know much about being Black as a Black person does. Yet counterintuitive as it may seem, your voice will carry a weight on matters of race that a Black person's will not, if only because you can't be dismissed. They can't dismiss your advocacy as self-interest." And so I think it's important for all of us to be thinking about how can we become allies? How can we become advocates? And that's really the goal of the work that we do. And a lot of the pieces are the same pieces that you're going to find in most of these programs. And with that, I'll turn it over to William. Unmute yourself.
One of the things we've learned is that that part of this work is to be stimulating and encouraging folks to get into the sacred conversation. And so our initial workshops were one-time workshops. Usually, it started with 1 hour at a Presbyterian education setting, but then it went to 3-hour workshops in multiple settings with different denominations, with Catholic churches, with ecumenical groups of Catholic and Protestants, with groups who had wanted us to come and groups that we had contacted. Some of the work was with groups of pastors, like UCC pastors, or Presbyterian pastors, Lutheran pastors. Some of the learnings that we had, really I wanted to share. One of the things that really comes up a lot is that it's very central that you have personalized experience using film clips of people's shared experience, like slave narrative from the Federal Writers Project in 30 podcasts. It's important that there's interaction, that people are allowed to respond from their own experiences. How do they engage this first in their lives, and what's happening in their lives now? One of the differences in our perspective is that, in fact, all the training that we do is expecting that as you get into this, you then too become a trainer of others. When we say training, we're talking about a Freirean kind of interactive education model. But there is once you begin to explore the sacred conversation, you then are saying, this is the part of your life from now on. So one of the things that comes up is that this is not just something that you're interested in. It's not something that's a hobby. It's really opening up to you that this is a part of your spiritual life, your ministry life, your social life, and it becomes something that will grow. And because of that, there's always a part of our workshops that understands the new that we have come to understand, or something that's been brought to us. One of the things we're working with now in terms of the future workshops we have is Isabel Wilkerson's concept of caste in her book Caste and the Origins of Its Discontent. Because one of the problems that people have is to get their mind wrapped around the all-encompassing nature of racism in our society. One of the things that that Marty was talking about, you know, the idea that people say, this doesn't involve us because we don't have Black folks in our area. The myth that this is about prejudice and the sense that people have that it's about prejudice, which misunderstands that it's about the structure of our whole society. And in fact, if there are no people of color in your area, that's a good starting point. Asking yourself, well, how did we get to be an area that didn't have a different mix of ethnicities and people of color, so that wherever you're at, what your community is experiencing is your opening point, your learning point. So, you know, with that in mind, just say that one of the things that Alan and I have experienced is different folks in different congregations will have their own sort of next step. And so part of our thing has been to encourage all those next steps, to be available if they want us to help them with it, but really to encourage it and participate in it. So one of the things that we do for our own growth and to contribute to those who have worked with us, when they have a book study, like they had a book study on Jesus and the Disinherited, we joined that. Right now they're working with, one group is working with the book Cast. And so we joined that. And try to create that kind of network of interacting folks that are responding in their faith communities in the way they respond, to encourage and to connect those kinds of communities.
Great. Okay, well, what a rich set of presentations here so far, and I'm so grateful to all of you for offering your reflections. And at this time, I'd really like to open it up for questions. And I see Helen's hand up. So Helen.
I had 3 questions. One, the anti-racism work in Oneonta. I'm with Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, and we have Quakers in Oneonta who are interested in anti-racism training and activities and community involvement. And I wanted to know what you're doing. Is it specific to members of your church? Do they have to be members of your church, which I understand if that's the way it is, to get involved? Or would we be allowed to inform Quakers and invite Quakers in Oneonta to participate? My second question is, you said that when you started the work, there were pastors who were not interested in getting involved, or members of your faith community who were not interested in getting involved. And I was wondering how you address that. And my last question I put in chat, and I think it was already answered: could we get a list of the resources you mentioned? Thank you.
Great. All right.
Sounds
well,
like
that sounds like a question for you, Marty.
Okay. Hi, Ellen. Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, when we taught this by Zoom, the Imagine No Racism out of Oneonta, it was because it was by Zoom. We had people from lots of places, and it was ecumenical. We had some Roman Catholics, we had some Presbyterians, we had some folks who didn't have any religious connections, and that was very rich, really. I think since it started as more or less a requirement from our bishop, it was very much populated by United Methodist clergy and lay people, but then others heard about it and, you know, joined on. I think our next steps would be very, very open to Quakers, and also the temple, the synagogue across the street, I would say, is one of our strongest partners, because we've done taken turns hosting the Martin Luther King Day service that we do, and other things that we do together. They're very active in the NAACP, as I am too. So yes, the answer to your first question is certainly Quakers would be very welcome for any kind of other work we do in this area in Oneonta. As far as pastors not being interested, you know, I don't know, you probably don't know, we have a system that's quite hierarchical, in the sense that we are all answerable to a bishop, and the bishop can require things of us. But it doesn't mean that all the clergy do these things willingly. So they may have given it lip service and then said, oh, I did that, check, when they really didn't, you know. So, but on the other hand, I'm glad that our bishop was strong on this issue, and at least required all the clergy to, you know, like I said, dip their toe in, whether they were really interested. It's very hard to get somebody to learn something if they really don't want to learn it. And those of you who are educators probably know that better than me. So that's all I'll say about that, I guess.
Okay. I'll just say quickly, and then open it up for other reflections on this, is that we will be publishing all the videos plus a listing of periodicals and also trainings, and you know, on our website. That's the plan going forward. So it's kind of a repository, and you know, just send us a note if anything comes across your radar screen that you'd like us to be aware of, then we always will put it up on our events calendar and so on. But other, did Helen's question provoke some thoughts from others who, you know, are thinking about how they relate to other people of other denominations, or how you've worked with clergy who might be somewhat resistant to coming? You know, what, any thoughts about what that might be about, or other folks?
I would say that for the Upper New York United Methodist Conference, the people in the pews are about 97% white.
Mm-hmm.
So that, of course, those are the people who need this, but that's just a factor. And people in white communities and white churches just have a real hard time seeing that this is not about, we don't have the problem here, so it's no problem. That's a big barrier.
You know, I'll add to that, Peter. You know, I think the fact that what what Blenda just said is that, you know, there's 97% of the people in their Upper New York Conference are probably white. And you know what? Part of it is also that, you know, these are the folks that have to start to learn about it, but it's not something that they're just going to go in and do a book study and come away saying, oh, now I'm all set to go. That's not how it works. It's, you know, everybody learns at a different pace. Everybody finds different things that turn them on. And it's going to have to be, and it doesn't have to be 52 weeks a year that they're doing it, but 2 or 3 times a year, that should be one of the options of things that they can access and learn about and do some, maybe it's some self-study, maybe it's group study. Our churches are great places for small groups, and that's how that growth is going to take place. And so it's just having, you know, somebody that's stimulating that conversation on a regular basis. And that's why, you know, we can, as New York Conference, we can be an incredible resource for people that want to do this. If you need trainers, if you need somebody to come in to help facilitate it, you know, we can have a network of people that are able to do this throughout the state. And so it's geographic more than anything else, because our state is much bigger than what it looks like on a map. And certainly when you start to drive it, you find out that it is. But I think that's one of the key pieces, is that, you know, that there's a network of folks that can help groups and whoever they are and facilitate this conversation. It may start out with a workshop conversation and then move into some additional learning, because those who are further along can be trainers. They can decide that, hey, this is some of the areas that I want to get in and I want to work in, and they reach out and do that. Maybe they learn about that through a workshop. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's through some other thing. But it's a journey, and it's a journey that's going to take place over several years, because that's just how it happens.
All right. So Sister Catherine Darcy, I'll give you the next question. I see your hand
Okay.
up.
Yeah, let me just introduce myself. I am not a pastor. I am a Sister of Mercy, and I've gotten involved with Peter with the Ecumenical Interfaith Advocacy Days. So I'm still on the mailing list. But I'm working in justice issues, and I'm a member of the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, and we've been working at this almost 20 years. Back in 2005, we had a major meeting, which we have every 6 years, and we decided racism was one of the things that we needed to work on. And I really appreciate what Reverend Wilkinson said. Having no Blacks in your area is a good starting point. You know, our sisters have worked with people in poor neighborhoods, many of whom were African American, for decades and decades and decades. And we have a handful of sisters that are people of color. So we still, after 20 years, we still have an immense amount of work to do. So I don't really have a question, but you know, I really appreciate what you're doing, and I'm going to tell folks about it in the sisters. You know what I really appreciated in the Ecumenical Advocacy Days was that the consideration for every one of those bills, the handouts for the bills, you wanted to root it in teaching theology as well as anti-racism. And I think that is a great way to raise consciousness on that. Really appreciated that. So
Great. Okay. Carol from Riverside Church in New York City. I'll let you have the next question.
Okay, thank you. I'm co-convener of our fairly new anti-racism task force. We've had a couple of study series, and we agree that we're all about both understanding and taking action. We're just now deciding what action to prioritize going forward from here. We want to make an indent in inequity. A couple things we're thinking of are the New York City, the amendments to the New York City Charter that would strengthen equity. And we're supporting Poor People's Campaign actions, April 9 and June 18. So that's about as far as we've got. What actions are you all prioritizing? We sure benefit from knowing what folks are focused on.
All right. Somebody like to respond?
I would start by saying it depends on where a local church is in terms of their knowledge and their interest and whatever. So very often, as I said before, they're busy trying to figure this out and share it with others in the congregation. So it's a very local kind of intervention. There are other groups like the United Methodist Women who did a whole Lenten series on Zoom with the school to prison pipeline. And they have a grant to do some real good activity, but I'm not privy to what that is. So it can be as little as a book study, a movie, let's talk, or as dramatic as getting out there and being active in the community. Not a clear answer, I'm sorry. Charles.
Those are the categories, yeah. We have also some targets within Riverside Church, but we'll go into those next time. Yeah, I just wonder, Peter, also, you may have
Yeah, well,
the others
I
speaking.
mean, I would just say as a, I mean, the two that you mentioned are great, but I think it's good to just have a theoretical framework in what we do to make it part of people's pastoral practice, you know, like just like they might deliver a casserole to a parishioner, you know, who's suffering, the part of their practice is to, you know, show up at the next town,
Right.
you know, district meeting. I'm sorry, my dog's barking here. Just go and listen and see what you can learn. And, you know, we try to publish events all day long on our, you know, website where we just we put those up there because we want people to just go and have that experience of advocating. So I, you know, I just make it my own practice to show up to rallies. You know, sometimes I'm asked to speak, most of the time I'm not, and I just go and I listen and I pick up conversations with people and take solace in knowing that I'm part of a greater movement. And sometimes things that I hear might be challenging or annoying or whatever, but you know, I'm building community. I'm listening to lawmakers. I'm listening to, you know, ask them, you know, tell me, what are you working on? What do you care about? You know, so just making that part of the fabric of what we do in pastoral ministry is, I think, kind of what I would say.
Peter, I can add a couple of things to that, and it takes in a little different twist. Number one, you know, one of the things that, looking at the group here, you're all very interested in this. So this is something that you might be able to do for yourself. And that is identify an organization of, you know, where African Americans are doing some social justice work, and show up at their meeting and find out what that's all about. And you might be surprised that you might get involved in it. There's one here in Rochester. It's called United Christian Leadership Ministries. And the Reverend Lewis Stewart does an incredible amount of social justice work, especially as it relates to criminal justice reform. And you get working with him and in his organization, I've just gotten involved in things that I never would have seen. The other thing that can be done, and this is sort of ecumenical, but as an interim pastor, my ecumenical clergy group, wherever I am, has become a very important group for me. And I happen to have a very strong one where I am right now. And we formed a social justice group with and this is the Episcopal clergy, Episcopal priest, Baptist pastors, Methodist pastor, myself, and the Lutheran pastor. And we've drawn people that have social justice interest in from our congregations and are doing and are working on this together. And because you're not going to find a whole, you might, if you've got a large enough church, you might find a whole group of people that want to do it there. But this also helps us to reach out ecumenically and do some justice things. Where we've got a new chief of police in Greece, and we've met with him and we've talked to him about what can we do to help him. And so there's a lot of things as churches you can do, and there's things that you might think about doing with some of your neighborhood churches. But
Mhm.
one of my recommendations, in addition to your own personal growth in this, is to get out and reach out and get involved in some activities where there's anti-racism activities going on in your local community.
Okay, I don't know,
Thank
Carol,
you.
was that helpful?
Very, thank you all very much.
Okay,
Can I
good.
add to that a little bit?
Sure. Go
Oh,
ahead.
just very briefly, Carol, and also what Blenda said, here in Oneonta, I've been elected to the, or appointed to the City Commission on Human Rights and Community Relations. So we've met with our new mayor and with our new police chief. We have a new mayor and new police chief in the last 6 months to help, work on, how can we be a more welcoming place and a more just place. And during the, first summer after the murder of George Floyd, we had put up a Black Lives Matter temporary banner or a kind of an A-frame sign in front of the church, and we got a lot of vandalism of it. So we made a permanent one that's way up high, so people can't vandalize it. And it's become a very good, I think, conversation in terms of reminding the congregation who we are and what we're up to, that the church is a safe place for everyone. And we also support the new Juneteenth celebration that the NAACP has started here in one of our bigger parks, and supporting that, and also especially working on supporting and patronizing Black-owned business. Contractors, restaurants, cafes, bakeries. We have a list of all the Black-owned businesses right here in town, and we circulate it and make sure people are going there first, and trying to strengthen those.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marty. Gary Van Kennen, and then I have a question from David Fletcher in the chat. Actually, let me go to David's question first. He asks, how have upstate youth responded, and how have younger children responded, in your view, to these initiatives?
As participants, we really haven't engaged young people. However, I know Charles is working with a subgroup to create or to tailor the curriculum for young people. I don't know, Charles, if you want to say more about that.
Yeah, there's a group of us now who are looking at the possibility of building an imaginal racism experience for younger kids, yeah, for adolescents, and particularly for adolescents. And we're starting from the viewpoint that adolescents are not little adults. They're a separate developmental phase, and their experiences are different. So if you can imagine, there's a bunch of adults trying to come up with a curriculum for our experience for kids without involving kids. So I think that's going to be our next move, to kind of figure out where they are at and what makes sense to move forward with.
Okay. I would just say that the Children's Defense Fund that we work with probably has some pretty good ideas about this, and it would be really good to connect with them. And I also think that paying really close attention to policies that are affecting kids in youth is really worthy of adult attention. You know, are kids getting adequate after-school programs? Why is it that childcare is so incredibly hard to access here? You know, in our communities which experience a lot of violence, what are the social structures that allow kids to, you know, be able to interact meaningfully and not be lulled into, you know, more violent or criminal activity? You know, showing up in your public school settings and asking how you can be present and help and building a relationship. You know, these are all things that I think are really helpful. And then also you might discover that there are children or youth in your community not coming to your church, but who are leading in some really powerful and constructive ways, and to go and see how you can support them and learn from them. So Gary, I'll give you the next question here. Gary Van Kennen.
Part of my question has been answered, but I would like to say that Blenda's statement about white communities not having Black people to any great extent populating their communities, and they don't need the anti-racism training, is reminiscent of the same churches in rural communities that don't say they don't need accommodations and accessibility because they don't have differently abled people attending. And there's an attitude of that I think you're cracking through that impacts that type of attitude. My question is, and I may be getting out over my skis on this, is you're talking about anti-racism activity, facilitating training within the church population, which is an obvious go-to for pastors. But do you have a next step plan where you train and facilitate these people to reach out into the general community to intentionally do this work? For instance, there might be on a Sunday, I live in a community of 10,000. On a Sunday, maybe there's 300 people in a church. How do we get to those 9,700 who aren't going to hear anti-racism through the church?
Okay.
I would say at least for our Imagine No Racism curriculum, it is clearly Christian based. We look at parables of Jesus and pray and whatnot. So that sounds like it would be a limitation. But we also do have groups that don't, facilitators form their own groups, and they don't have to be United Methodist or Christian, but they're going to get some Christianity in there by nature of the way this curriculum is developed.
But a church group could decide as part of their action plan that they're going to be active in the community at large. Or they could decide that they're going to lead or facilitate a community forum or community discussion on a particular issue. Maybe it's housing, maybe it's voter registration, maybe it's something along that line. So the church isn't necessarily obligated to stay in the church. They can move outside if they wish. And we certainly have had some churches that have been ecumenical. We've had some churches that have done some things like bringing speakers in and opening it to the community at large. So that always is a possibility.
Mhm.
I just say one quick thing that, particularly for United Methodists, I always like to say this, is that clergy are not called to a church. They are called to a community in which their church dwells. And your parish is not really your members, although it is part of that, but your parish is the community around you. And I think that's a good mindset for all baptized Christians, in terms of how they understand who they are and what they're doing, and that being Christian is by definition one of how you reach out to people who are not Christian, and doing that in a respectful, collaborative kind of way. Dr. Victoria, you have the next question.
Thank you, Reverend Peter. I am grateful for this really rich gathering, communion, as it were, with people's thoughts and grappling with a very difficult and vital, important social justice issue. I just want to say two quick things and then ask a question, please. I have the honor and joy of working under Miss Carla Burns, who has been leading anti-racist trainings, that's the word, in the Episcopal Diocese of New York. And I'm now working under her with the anti-racist summits. And we have come together, not saying we know the answers, but trying to come up with the questions that help other people find their own answers. It's so far been working very well. And I think that if you're interested, you could check out the website and see under Carla's leadership. It's a very wonderful resource. I'm learning a lot. And I also, as a theologian, say the issue undergirding all of this, it seems to me, is the issue of othering, which is a term that theologians have been grappling, and certainly Scripture grapples with, who are on the margins and who is considered the other, who is the outcast, Samaritan, the woman at the well, Good Samaritan, person who's robbed, etc. And so I think the deeper issue is for, as Gandhi said, be the change we want to see, and to first start with looking at our own hearts and seeing where we draw the line in terms of who do we include in our circle of friends, associates. We've come up with some suggestions for the people who attend our summits, things like, do you consciously try to socialize with a group other than your usual group? Do you take a bus trip somewhere in a neighborhood that's different from yours? Do you start a conversation on a bus with someone that looks different than you do? It's not all about looks, but certainly that is one separation that automatically comes. So I work as co-chair of the Domestic Violence Task Force, and I know that the majority of victims, both in domestic violence and sexual assault and human trafficking, are people of color, particularly women. And I wonder if the people that are leading in this ecumenical group have also been connecting these dots. If you look at the ACE study for children and how they've experienced trauma, you can map the same map for poverty places in the world, for example, the Bronx being one. And so I'm wondering, how can we widen the net on this very important topic? We have a resource called the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta under the able, capable hands of Dr. Catherine Meeks. She has a curriculum developed for those of you who are interested in working with young people that can be shared, or they will come and actually train you to be part of the healing that is hopefully going to happen with the youth, because that's where our hope is. So I've got really two questions in there. But basically, how can we widen the net to connect all of these social justice issues that do not live in isolation with one another? Thank you.
All right. Who, anyone's welcome to respond to these questions, who's participating here. So
let me just respond to a couple of the streams of thought. One is this whole idea of widening the net. When Alan and I first started to work on this stuff, we were sitting around the Greater Rochester. We were sitting around the Greater Rochester Community of Churches table, and we said, you know what? There are not enough people of color around here. We got to do something about that. And one of the people who was around the table was the late Wilma Campbell of the Rochester Friends. And she called me up one night and said, I've got this idea. Maybe I'm being too egoistic. This is the most humble woman I ever met. She said, there's this film, I'm Not a Racist, Am I? And I'm with a group of people that want to do that with school kids in the suburban school districts and maybe in Rochester. And we said, okay, we made that our anti-racism program and supported her and the group she was working with to make that happen. Out of that, we developed an ecumenical, multiracial study group during Lent. I think it was 2013 or 14 now, on the cross and the lynching tree. Again, what happened was we looked at who we were connected to and listened for who was asking the questions. And we supported them asking those questions and built our programs around the work that our colleagues were doing. Now, that's one thing. So that work with youth is about looking where the youth at, showing up there, and then responding to what's going on. The second piece is we learned very early on that the church wasn't going to do this alone. Not even ecumenical or interfaith were we going to do it alone. And so we joined a group called, actually we started this group, but then we really sort of got into an interfaith social justice group. At the time, we were part of Gamaliel. Now we're part of Faith in Action. And it's interesting how this works. We got involved with them because they were involved in community justice work. But in their last annual meeting, it was us who brought the issue of racism underlying all this justice work that made them say, no, we've got to target racial justice and anti-racism education in order to do our justice work. So it really is about building that network beyond the church, between the religious organizations, and becoming a part of the partnerships that are developing. From the third thing I wanted to say, and that's the last thing I'm going to say, is having worked in a congregation in Rochester doing justice work for a number of years, when I was called to the ministry here in Medina, farmers, school teachers, and a few business people, I said to myself, well, how am I going to grapple with this justice work? And I said, let's go to the confessions that we use in worship and study. And so our first adult ed was about the confessions that speak to race and reconciliation. And then the second adult ed was the church and social justice. And in that curriculum, church and social justice, one of the suggestions it had was, in the fourth session, suggest to your group that you have an interracial experience. Well, in the third session, one of the people said, hey, I heard that Trinity Emmanuel, an African-American congregation in Rochester, is having their annual heritage dinner. We've got to go to that. And sure. And so we went to that, but it arose out of them grappling with something that was very familiar and then making the connection and then encouraging that, to get that facilitator's hat on. It really is about encouraging people to do the things that are in front of them. Now, after that, I looked at our ecumenical association, and who's the member of that. We discovered there's an African-American church that's about half a mile away from our congregation. And guess who? And what they said when we first started talking about dealing with racism, they said, we've got a young people's group that does a whole 1619 play. Now, that happened just as COVID was breaking out. And so one of the things that's on our list now is get back to that church and say, are you back in person? And can that young people's group present for us as an ecumenical group? So it really is looking at what the relationship you already have and listening, oh my gosh, there's stuff here. And then moving with that. It may not be where you end up, but it will be the bridge to the next part of the work.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said, William. Thank you. That kind of organic relational approach, I think, is so much needs to be part of the fabric of what we do. So Dahlia Herring, you have a question.
Well, it's more of a comment, just commenting on a few of the themes that have come up recently. One thing I wanted to say was that in reality, let me just back up. I have had the honor and wonderful experience of facilitating many different conversations with many different groups, particularly white groups, both in the church and outside of the church. And I can tell you that I have used the curricula of the various denominations, but particularly one experience I had was taking the UCC curriculum and using it to facilitate a 6-week series of workshops, using that curriculum to folks who were unchurched completely, who had, this was the public. And it was a very rich curriculum. You do have to change it and customize it. And I guess that's one of my comments. One of the things we do in anti-racist work often is called caucusing, which means that you go to the group that is your group. So when I'm with Christians and we're having the conversation, there are particular things in our tradition that really get at the heart of why we're doing this, that may not translate very easily to other groups. Then with my Jewish friends, there are other things that would particularly grab at their heart. And I think we need to be respectful of that diversity. This again is in the theme of diversity and unity, because basically underneath it all, the principles are still the same. And so that's why it is so easy to take many of these curricula and to apply them to different groups.
Right. Okay. We have time for somebody who does not have their hand up, who hasn't spoken, have verbally just want to ask a question. Okay. Well,
I have a question.
oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Gloria.
All right. I'm just been listening. So this is something new for everyone starting up, and they starting up within their church. Am I correct? And the reason why I'm saying that, I've been in many of these. The best one that I really enjoy as far as established is up under the Reformed Church of Princess Bay, not Princess Bay, Reformed Church in America or of America. Because not only did they have it in different churches, but it also, because of their doctrine, there was a conflict. So, I mean, they really went deep as far as trying to find common grounds and how to have peace with different culture and different denomination. And it was called Racism in the Church. And they took us from history into the present time now. We pray, We repent, both sides, everybody, because no one's perfect. And it is work, but you have to be honest with yourself, because even to a person of color can be racism. It does. Racism to me is not about one culture. We all got issues with different cultures. So, this is something that we must face and work with it together. And that will help our young folks, because a lot of them, they done inherited from generations. So it's a job, but this is a start. That's all I wanted to say.
Right, and Gloria is from Staten Island, the Princess Bay Reformed Church, and it's great to have you here, and you have contributed so much to our conversations. In fact, it's nice. We had a nice smattering of people from all around the state here today. So that I think is quite great. We're going to conclude, but I want to thank everyone for your participation today. We will be publishing this online, so you can go back and ponder what is being said. I think the plan is to also try to write some key learnings out of each session that people can refer back to, and also to please share with us resources that you're working with, curriculums, videos, trainings, educational events that you're doing, and then we are going to schedule these conversations once a month. And so I'm not sure yet what the conversation will be for May, but expect a wide range of topics and visitors, as we continue looking at the question of how we do anti-racist work together in our congregations and out in the community. All right. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording here, and I'll keep things open if people still want to stick around and chat, but I'm going to stop the recording now.